In today's episode, we had Naomi Hossain, a political sociologist who studied development in Bangladesh and the Global South. She heavily studied and researched the famine that happened in 1974 in Bangladesh, and today we talked about many things, but in particular, what's happening in Bangladesh right now, and the famine that happened, and what'll happen next. So stay tuned. We really enjoyed this one. If you like what we're doing, like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys soon.
The Inspire Us podcast.
I dropped economics as soon as I possibly could.
You couldn't stand it?
I mean, it's just like fairy tale stuff. It was like invented stuff. I mean, I went to Oxford. It was a really bad place. I mean, I had a very nice teacher.
Why was it bad?
I couldn't sustain the fiction in my mind. Like all of the assumptions were so far from anyone's lived realities. This, of course, was the 1991 it must have been. I was an undergraduate, or 1990, something like that. It was a long time ago.
Okay. So you saw through the shit, basically.
I mean, I kind of regret that I didn't stick it out because I found it easy. I found it interesting. And, now I'm a political sociologist. But economics background is always really good for any social science
so there's a
field that you want to go into, I think.
There's a part of you that regrets it.
I think one economist is all right in a relationship.
Yeah, I think there might be a clash.
No, it's fine. And I never wanted to work for someone like, I didn't really want to work for a place like the World Bank, anything like that.
Why not?
It doesn't appeal. There's quite a lot of, you're a banker, essentially.
But it feels like you're
pushing money out the door, right? I mean, my husband, he works on education. And education is one of those areas where the World Bank is, it's less neoliberal on that than it is on, or maybe the neoliberalism of public education is just about acceptable. They don't encourage privatization in particular, but with a lot of other
sectors.
Yeah, it's all about, market forces and, you can't really do that with public education. Basic education should be public at wherever you are. There's very few countries. The US we're seeing now, they're going to, they've already cancelled the Federal Department of Education, But the state's still, obviously, public education is provided just at the state level, not at federal level, I guess. But, it's always been a target of the political right. Public education, they don't like, because it's big money, lots of taxes, and then they don't like, people telling their kids what to do. And homeschooling is really big in the US already.
That's being here. I've always found it like absurd that people homeschool. I don't know, because it's not really common here, is it?
It's not very common here. It's quite regulated in the US. If you don't feel like sending your kids to school, it's not very hard. I knew so many people who homeschooled, and their children. We're not recording, are we? Some of them came out a bit odd.
They do. Not to be rude, but there's something about them.
Yeah.
And you can be like, there's some rubbish taught in schools. You might not agree with everything. But I think you do benefit from being with your peers and bouncing off of your peers. Yeah, and it sort of grounds you as a person. And when you don't have that, you can tell. Well, I've met two people who have been homeschooled, and it was very...
Are they both American?
Not American, but their dads were like very international, like Hong Kong and Singapore.
So in the US, the public schools, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of drugs, guns. A lot of people think, I don't want my kids near that stuff, and then they seclude them, and it's very strange. So I don't know. It's very strange. That's a very strange place, but that's so that's, so you could be an economist in the World Bank doing social protection or climate change or something, and it wouldn't necessarily be so bad, but it wasn't the thing for me. I just wanted to be a nerd. I wanted to be an academic.
So what is it that you actually do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I joined SOAS about a year and a half ago. And I was working before that at American University in Washington, D.C., and I was working for a research center called the Accountability Research Center. And we essentially studied and helped support activists who are seeking accountability for various kinds of things, especially around public service delivery. Our government's doing what they say they're doing, Where is the money really going? Are we really getting what we're supposed to get? How can we make governments perform better? And other entities, but chiefly governments.
So like Doge before Doge, a little bit.
Very, very unlike Doge. If they could be a polar opposite to Doge, then...
But it sounds similar.
I know, it's a really good point, actually, because accountability is...
Keep that mic.
Oh, have you started?
Yeah.
Accountability has become one of those issues that really has been picked up by the left and by the right. It's a really popular concept now. It's quite interesting when you think about it, because, the Doges of this world they claim they're doing accountability. And, activist groups working with grassroots community people. We used to work in the Accountability Research Center we used to work with a group of Guatemalan indigenous health rights defenders. Like, you cannot get more grassroots, you know. And these people are working to basically hold the government accountable for health services being delivered in really quite remote places in Guatemala. Not Doge, in other words. But, accountability takes lots of different forms. So you can have, we talk about, protest movements, huge big protest movements that we've seen a lot more this century than we saw last century or previously in the world. Much bigger, more organized. Social media has helped people organize that. That's a kind of accountability. It's a kind of accountability in a context in which politics no longer really serves that function. I think more and more people agree. Democratic politics, I mean, but other kinds of politics too. So accountability comes in all kinds of other forms now. So we look at those sorts of things. That's a big topic for me, is accountability issues. Right now I'm developing a proposal on complaints systems, because I think everyone's very cynical about complaint systems. They mostly are designed, some people say, there's a famous feminist scholar called Sarah Ahmed. She says they're designed to fail. They're designed to protect institutions, not to help you get what you need. Have you ever tried registering a complaint about something?
No.
Why not? You never had any problems with the public service or anything?
Oh, it's just too much kerfuffle, really.
Too much kerfuffle, exactly, right?
Yeah, I'd rather get on with it. And I think that's the case for most people.
I think it is, yeah.
There's just something about logging a complaint.
And seeing it disappear into some portal, never to be seen again, right?
Soul destroying, it takes away from you.
It does. It really does. And all the research shows that many people, particularly in the global south where I do most of my work, much prefer face-to-face. And now with AI and so on, you can imagine what's going to happen is that complaints are going to disappear into this portal. AI is going to do whatever magic tricks it does. It's more and more. It's coming up more and more already. And, you'll never know how the decision was made about your complaint. You'll never know what happened to it, how it was processed, whose eyes actually saw it, or how you can appeal or, take it forward if you need to. It's all, these are the workings of power.
So how would you like to change this complaint system? Like, what do you...
How would I like to?
Yeah.
The thing is, I don't have an answer to that yet. The fact is that we have, all around the world, it's become a really big thing in the last 20, 25 years in the public sector, in government services, in all walks of life. If you go to a health clinic, you go to a school, your teacher doesn't show up, whatever it is, it's more and more common that you have complaint systems. And not only that, organizations like the World Bank, by their policies, they have to have a complaints mechanism. They call it a grievance mechanism for every single project. So that if something goes wrong, people have a chance to complain. Sometimes, for instance, they have big road building projects, and then there's, sexual violence and sexual harassment of the local community. So they have to have these. Or there is procurement going on for a project and somebody's stolen the money, or somebody's built a shitty road or something with low-grade materials and pocketed the rest. So you have to have these. In fact, most of the big multilateral agencies have these kinds of complaints mechanisms. It's not, we don't really know how they work. I think that's why we're doing this. We're trying to design this project, is globally, everyone has them, but nobody's ever really thought about how they work. And, one of the things is that some of them are not really designed to work for people who complain.
Do you think there's some biases sort of baked into it? Because I feel if a certain group of people complain, you're going to hear about it and there will be action taken.
You're so right.
And if, let's say, another group of people complain, then their voices feel unheard.
Absolutely. I think that's true. And, a lot of people, we were talking about AI and, digital complaints mechanisms is a really big thing, right? The portals and all that. It's right for you young people, your generation, people like me, my parents, they would never have been able to use these sorts of things. It's so complicated and so many pathways and decisions and so on. So some people will never be able to complain. In fact, we know that the vast majority of complaints that people have, say, for instance, in health services, which is a really big area for this, most people don't bother to complain. They'll just grumble, or they'll complain, or they might vote for a new government next time, or they might, if they can, withdraw from the sector. The famous exit voice loyalty, Albert Hirschman. Did you read Albert Hirschman when you did your master's in economics? No. That's a classic. Do read it. It's a very influential for consumer complaints and that sort of thing, but it's a classic. He was just this amazing polymath, kind of all subjects he could talk about. But he talked a lot about people who stop buying stuff from firms because they don't like it anymore. So you need to have a grievance redressment, a complaints system, so that you can fix what's wrong with your services or your goods, so that people don't. Why was I telling you that? I can't remember. Oh yes. So lots of people don't really go and complain, and they just kind of withdraw. They exit, essentially, from the relationship. Which is what you don't want if you're a government, because, think about us here in the UK. Something goes wrong in your local NHS clinic. What are you going to do? Most of us can't really go along to the private hospital or whatever. It's not feasible. There may not be one. It's probably not very good anyway, and we can't afford it. Many of us wouldn't want to anyway, because we believe in the NHS.
I guess it's quite difficult, because we actually have a mate of ours who he doesn't speak English, and he's here and he has a family. And people like him, he can't understand what the doctors are saying to him. And I do think increasingly in this country, there's a large group of people who can't really speak English. So they're probably left at the helm of these very bureaucratic systems, which doesn't really allow them to sort of be able to voice a complaint, because it's extremely, like, they can't understand what these forms are saying, what these people are saying. So how would you address that? Because I've heard people on the right say, this is our country and you should assimilate. And I do understand that point of view, but maybe the other argument is, like, they're still here, they're citizens, and they should be able to extract the services which they pay taxes for.
Absolutely. Of course they should. And, we can't all learn a new language if we arrive late in life and so on. But it's not only just not being able to speak English, for instance. It's actually like a different language. How do you know the correct term for, some medical procedure if you're not a doctor or a nurse or a medical professional? Or, you need to be very highly educated, and you need to be, quite capable of figuring out the ways to frame your complaint in such a way that it will be what we call legible. So many, many complaints just get deleted because they're not relevant. No, we're not accepting complaints about this. So, for instance, in Pakistan, there's something called the Benazir Income Support Program. It's a social protection scheme, which is, they give money, they give cash to, women from low-income households. And they have a complaints mechanism because, the international aid donors supported this program and they wanted to make sure it was working well. So they put this in. It's an accountability mechanism. And the vast majority of the complaints they get are, why am I not on the list? There wasn't enough money to give everyone who needed it some of this payment. And so this is what people are complaining about. It's like, hey, I should be on this list. I'm poor. I'm not eating well. Why am I not on the list? But the complaint system is not set up to handle things like that. It's not set up to handle policy. So your point about the how am I going to get the services I need if I don't speak the language? It's not just about, not being able to speak English. It's not being able to speak doctor. It's not being able to speak healthcare. It's, these systems are often designed as you say, for the institution. Like they don't think about how is the very poorest person. What about one of these, bless them, these unhoused people who live around Bloomsbury? How are they going to go and get health care? They don't have a device, or they don't know where to find out the information about what kind of, most people don't know these things exist.
True.
But in that sense, do you think AI is going to fix that? Because if you have a AI complaint system that can basically translate normal speak to doctor speak to be able to have more efficient complaints, would that be able to help?
That's a very good point. Yeah, that could very well help, I think. And not only that, AI can probably also, if it's trained to, listen to what people are saying, you know, on social media, in the ether, in public discourse, and figure out what the problems are without every single individual having to make a complaint. The whole point about an accountability mechanism is that it should render itself redundant over time. That if you're a corrupt public servant or politician and you know you're going to get caught because the accountability mechanism works so well, over time you will stop. The whole point is supposed to be preventive. Similarly with complaints, the whole point is that, you know, I'm a bureaucrat, I'm looking after the healthcare system, and I'm getting 55 complaints from this one clinic about there not being a doctor there or them having to wait long. So I'm going to look at this. I'm going to say something is not working there. Let's sort that out. Is it a policy problem? Have we hired the wrong person? Is something else going on there? And I'm going to fix the problem for everyone so that nobody has to waste their time making a complaint and following it up. Anyway, that's the nerdy stuff I'm working on right now.
But it seems like the complaint system that maybe happens because of all this inefficient complaint system is protests, right? You know, people maybe will have, because they can't complain to the NHS, they grumble along, and then eventually they had enough and they protest and something happens. Now, you could say, you know, protest is a secondhand system, or protest. Some will say they're inefficient. In some cases, they become more efficient. Like Bangladesh, you know, they had some recent protest. What do you think of all the jazz that happened?
Yeah, so much, right? So you see the kind of work I'm interested in. I'm interested in this stuff. I'm interested in how people get the stuff they need, get the services they need, and maybe they have to protest. Sometimes if they're very, very lucky, they'll vote and there'll be a great party and that party will deliver everything. But this seems to be less and less the case. Sometimes they complain. Yeah, so the protests in Bangladesh, well, that was quite a moment. And, you know, it was several months of, it was very, very stressful. I was sitting here in London, obviously, watching what was going on. And, you know, until a couple of months ago, Bangladesh is quite active on social media, but Facebook, essentially Facebook. And Twitter is really where the journalists and the political people were, you know, until recently. Now I'm not sure anyone's on social media anymore. Are they on social media anymore? I don't know. So I was tweeting a lot about this, trying to let the journalists, you know, the handful of journalists who write about Bangladesh, are interested in Bangladesh, know that this stuff was going on. And what was going on was that a student-led movement took to the streets in July, all through July. It was 6 weeks of July and the beginning of August. And they started off complaining, essentially, about this quota system in the public service, in government recruitment, that only a small number of people who were eligible because they passed the exams, and they're very, very difficult, very competitive exams, were getting these jobs because some of these jobs were earmarked, were kept aside for the grandchildren of people who had fought in the Liberation War in 1971. Right, so this is kind of a long, you know, this is like grandchildren now of these people who fought in 71. You know, why are they entitled to this, you know, particular benefit? And really what it meant was that these jobs were just going to cronies of the regime. And that regime was led by Sheikh Hasina. It was a real iron lady. She was a real toughie. She is still alive. She's in India now. She's a real toughie and also increasingly authoritarian and very, very violent. They disappeared lots of political opponents and so on. This had been going on for 10, 15 years. They'd been in power for 15 years.
They disappeared.
They disappeared people, yeah, an active verb, yeah, exactly. I mean, this is something that happens. It happened in Chile back in the Pinochet regime. And many governments have used this strategy of disappearing opponents. It's really insidious and it's really terrifying. You know, I know a couple of people to whom this happened. They were disappeared temporarily and then released again on grounds that they wouldn't, cause trouble. So these students took to the street, and the army and the police started shooting them. Wow. There was this one chap, Abu Saeed. He was an English student in Begum Rokeya University in Rangpur, which is actually my hometown. And I went to see where he was shot. I was there in January, and I went up north to see where he was shot. And this chap, he stood like this. He stood with his arms wide open, and flung his chest out while they were protesting when the army and the police came. And I guess believing they wouldn't shoot him. Really defiant. He was really defiant. He was early 20s, young chap. And they shot him, they killed him. And you can see the video online. Abu Saeed, his name was. It's a terrible thing. And that really changed the mood. First, people were protesting, politely, without violence. Started getting shot by the police, by the army. Can you imagine if you went out? You're just trying to get a decent job in the government on a fair basis, and they start shooting you? Wow. I mean, this was, the end for that.
Why do you think they were aggressive and shot citizens?
Because, there was a lot of stuff going on. But, when you've been in power for 15 years and you've just held a fake election 4 or 5 months before, and you're going to be sitting in power for another 5 years, no one's going to bother you, and you've stuck the opposition in jail, and that most of the newspaper editors are too scared to say anything very overt, although they were pretty good about reporting all of this violence and the killing of the students and so on. And also that you've got the army in your pocket because you're giving them lots of benefits. And similarly, the police are not going to say anything or do anything against you because you've given them loads of nice contracts. And then the big business people are all in your pocket too, because they're making out like bandits, as we now know. Your Professor Mushtaq Khan from the economics department, of course, has done loads of amazing work on the corruption that went on in Bangladesh. And I think he's right now in Bangladesh trying to recover some of the stolen funds, trying to help the government recover the stolen funds. He did a lot of very, very careful analysis of corruption in the procurement process, for instance, when they were building big power plants. A lot of people were making a lot of money that they should not have been. So there were lots of reasons to want to hold on to power, and lots of kind of Sheikh Hasina, I think she felt she had impunity. Nobody was going to touch her. And I think a lot of us, like I was sitting here in London, talking about this to the media and so on. I thought she was staying. I didn't think she would be going anywhere, because she had too much at stake. They'd killed too many people at one point for it to be easy for them to go, because then they would be held responsible.
So what was the turning point? So we had these student protests. I guess the military came down on them extraordinarily
hard. The military did, the police, the others. The ruling party had a bunch of so-called student, and youth groups as well, who were pretty violent. They're basically a bunch of thugs, criminal gangs, essentially, backed by the regime. The turning point, that's a very good question. So they killed quite a lot of people. They killed probably about, I don't think we've ever got the final numbers, maybe 1,500 people. Wow. And it wasn't just students as well. So it started off as students, lots of young people, lots of workers. The garments industry, the fashion industry is huge in Bangladesh. Lots of those workers came out to the streets as well, transport workers, others. There's a couple of really good short forensic films that were made earlier this year, which I've seen, which you can see online. The Integrity, the Truth. Oh, I can't remember the name of the organization. I'll dig it out for you. But these films have been reconstructed using social media footage. So people had posted on their Instagram reels or whatever, they were watching the police or army shooting people. Like, you can't go around shooting unarmed protesters. It's against the law. It's against all the laws. There's no way you can do that. So a lot of the ruling party tried to say, oh no, it wasn't us, or it was bad actors or whatever. And actually, these films have proven that this is what happened, was that the army and the police deliberately went out to shoot these young people on the streets. The turning point really was, it kept going on, it kept going on. They switched off the internet for about a week. And at that point, those of us sitting here in London, in the US and other places, were really frantically trying to get the world to pay attention, trying to get someone with a voice to speak on behalf of these people who are being massacred. And it was on the 5th of August, the student-led movement said, we're going to march to Dhaka. Dhaka's the capital city. We're going to go there, and we're all going to be there. And by this time, literally millions of people were taking to the streets, like everyone by this time. I mean, it's a big country, right? 175 million, so a couple millions here and there, and so if we can do that. Yeah, but there were millions of people, and people from all walks of life. I have friends who are big businessmen. They drive around in the fanciest cars you can imagine. They were there. People who pull rickshaws, they were there. Everyone was there. Mothers, grandmothers, everyone was there.
People had enough.
Sorry?
People had
had enough. And they also had realized that if they were going to go around and shoot everyone, well, how was this ever going to end? And you have to remember also at the same time what's been going on in Bangladesh, as is going on in other countries around the world, is massive inflation crisis, right? Cost of living crisis. So if you've spent 2 years since the invasion of Ukraine seeing your energy prices go up, food prices go up, of course, rent then goes up, everything goes up except for wages, of course. Salaries and wages take much longer to go up. So people are really struggling, but also unable to get rid of a government that was doing nothing for them. So all of this stuff really, and of course we saw the same thing happen in other countries as well. Other countries, people have, kicked out their governments because of the cost of living.
But then what I find fascinating about Bangladesh is that you've gotten rid of this iron lady who is suppressing political parties, but the narrative around Bangladesh now seems even more pessimistic. And they got in who they wanted in Muhammad Yunus, apparently. This is what the student protesters had vouched for, who advocated for. And now that he's in, people are saying he's a puppet and he isn't the man to...
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's so much going on right now. So what I think is not entirely clear to everyone is that I think the students and the movement itself, they didn't expect that they were going to kick Sheikh Hasina out. They didn't have a plan. They were not a bunch of politicians. They're very smart young people, but they did not have a plan. They did not expect to be holding the reins of power. In their 20s, these guys are. Country of 175 million people. So they, I think, decided that what they needed was an interim government. And we've had models like this before in Bangladesh where we've had complete political breakdown. You have a temporary government, a non-political government, step in, sort things out, reform, organize a free and fair election, stick the parties back in power. So that's really what they're trying to do right now. But after 15 years of this increasingly authoritarian regime, they really destroyed all the institutions. They've, fiddled with the constitution, the law, the courts are all captured. Even the media is heavily captured. Civil society was very much on the side of the ruling party. So they've got to do a bunch of different reforms, get the election commission, back up to speed. Anti-corruption commission as well, all of these sorts of institutions that are accountability mechanisms of various kinds. Got to get them back, got to get them reformed, restaffed, and so on. So that's really what they're trying to do right now, while also trying to figure out a timetable for elections. But of course, one of the parties has just gone around shooting everyone. Most of them now, that's the Awami League party, Sheikh Hasina's party. Many of the leaders have fled the country. Sheikh Hasina herself fled on August the 5th in a helicopter. Actually, this was the thing we were talking about. We didn't quite get to the end point. The turning point really was on August the 5th. There were millions of people coming into Dhaka, and it was quite clear that Sheikh Hasina was quite happy to shoot them all. She would happily have shot, she would have happily shot them all. But the chief of the army chief at that point stood up and said, you know what, we're not going to do this. We're not going to shoot any more young people. We're not going to kill any more people. And Sheikh Hasina then had to leave because she didn't have the authority. So it's a very classic, in political science, it's whoever holds the means of violence, right? Who has the monopoly of violence is the state. In this case, it was the army chief who made that decision, and that's why she left. That's why we got Professor Yunus. Why is everyone so down on him now? Not everyone is. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation coming from India. India was very happy with Sheikh Hasina. They got a lot of, they did a lot of, they had a lot of good policies with her as far as they were concerned. It was going very nicely for them. They don't like this new regime. They're very, very worried that Islamists will take over in the forthcoming elections, which is a possibility.
But people are saying that they kind of have. I've heard that like Bangladesh is now falling into like Islamist extreme, and it's just even for like women, it's becoming a worse and worse like case.
Yeah, it's really hard to get, a kind of sense of really what's going on. Yes, there have been a bunch of different incidents. I mean, there were those sorts of incidents, like, for instance, stopping girls' football games from happening, for instance. Those sorts of things did used to happen before as well. But there is some argument now being made by the Awami League that they were somehow the bulwark against Islamist extremism, somehow the great defenders of women's rights and so on. I don't think it's not entirely false, but it's not also definitely true. And they really weaponized the fear of Islamism to basically to silence their opponents, and it's not entirely true. The Jamaat Islami is the main Islamist party, really. They've been around for 50 years. They were affected very badly by the Sheikh Hasina regime. Some of their leaders were hanged for war crimes from back in 1971. We're always fighting 1971 again and again in Bangladesh. We never really quite get over it.
Well, maybe we can talk about 1971. But it seems quite sad, this whole situation, because, Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world, most densely populated, and they seem to have this, positive economic trajectory, and you see they're starting to manufacture, a lot of clothing, and it seems to be going good, kind of like the China model. And then boom, you have all this political stuff going on, and yeah, I mean, they do say that Bangladesh people are very resilient.
No, don't
like
they though? Yeah.
It's like how resilient must they be,
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. How resilient must they be? I mean, it's a country that, it's in the Bay of Bengal. So we have all of the tropical storms, the cyclones, Bangladesh, we always say, is the canary in the coal mine of global capitalism, climate change. Whatever they're facing now in Houston or central Germany or wherever, floods and droughts and whatever. We had it first in Bangladesh. We've had all these crises for years and years, going back possibly almost a century. We've been affected by climate change in really quite serious ways. So, Bangladesh really became a country after in a period of great crisis, lots and lots of major disasters. There was a huge big cyclone in 1970 that killed 500,000 people. It's like the worst disaster of its kind ever in world history. We had a massive famine that killed 1.5 million people. And, it's always been a kind of irrelevant place geopolitically until recently, perhaps. Now China has taken it seriously. It has certain geographical advantages, but irrelevant geopolitically in history because there's no natural resources. It's just got people. We've just got people. And so, of course, labor intensive export manufacturing was the obvious pathway. But, in the 70s, everyone thought we were going to do socialism and so on. It took a while before they embarked on the kind of economic development pathway that they're on now. And that's very dominated by ready-made garments, by T-shirts and sweaters in particular. I was looking at the numbers today because, the tariffs, Bangladesh was hit really hard by Trump's crazy tariffs. 34%, I think.
On Bangladesh?
Yeah. And you say one of the poorest countries in the world, but actually it's been growing so fast. There has been some, overstatement of how successful it's been economically, but not much.
But I
Really,
think I
there's a
heard
lot.
2026 it's gonna lose its. I think like
It's not going to
stat.
be a least developed country.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's been coming for some time. So we're no longer one of the least developed countries. We're growing quite fast. Infrastructure is quite amazing. Human development actually is one of the areas of great success in Bangladesh, which is not a great GDP story, but, people are healthier. They have, sanitation. Their children are immunized. Women have access to, reproductive health and so on, much more than in comparative countries. We started off in 71 when we became an independent country. All of our indicators were much lower than Pakistan and India. We broke away from Pakistan, was the story of 71 essentially. We were East Pakistan, and then there was 1,000 miles of India in between us. So West Pakistan, East Pakistan, 1,000 miles of India. I mean, whose idea for a country was that? That's just insane.
Two
think?
two divided
Yeah,
countries.
two wings. And so we broke away. All our indicators were much worse than Pakistan and India back in those days. Much, much worse. And, now mostly better on most things than Pakistan and India. And both Pakistan and India, were much richer countries. Now our GDP per capita is higher, I think, than both, depending on your metrics. But if you take, for instance, IMF data, then they seem to suggest, GDP per capita is higher than most. Human development indicators better than most. Other ways as well, as you say, resilience. We still have a lot of disasters, cyclones, floods, all kinds of things, and they kind of manage it. They're kind of so used to it. The government and civil society and, the general public kind of pull together. It's quite remarkable to see.
Yeah, I was actually reading about, because your economy is very labor intensive, this sort of gives power to the people. The government needs the people in work and to be somewhat content, because if you are in, let's say, Saudi Arabia, which is like essentially an oil state, that's mainly centered around machinery and capital, and the people aren't so important.
That's right.
So it's a lot easier in those countries to suppress political parties and have people be
disappeared.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, disappeared. I think that's incredibly insightful. Yes, you're absolutely right. A government that has no natural resources but its people must
treat the people well.
Must invest in them to some extent. Mustn't allow them to die from famine and storms and so on, because that's all they've got. And it's a bit the natural resource curse, I think, is part of it. We don't have that, and in some ways that has been a positive thing. And in particular, I would say, one of the things that Bangladesh did early on, from about the mid-70s, was really start to focus on women, and in particular rural poor women, because if you're not supporting them in any way, they're the people who bring up the family, right? Who bring up the children. They're the people who reproduce society, literally. And so Bangladesh really, after the famine in 74, I think they really started to realize, actually, we really need to focus on women. There was also a big, debate about fertility, about population control. Bangladeshi women were having 6-7 babies at that time, many of whom didn't live very long. And now I think it's, what is the total fertility rate? It's 2 or something like that. People have 1 or 2 babies mostly. Yeah. But and they take care of them well, which you can't do if you've got 7 babies and no money, right? So they invested in women, and Professor Yunus, who now runs the interim government for the next 6 months or 9 months or whatever, he's one of these people who set up the Grameen Bank. The Grameen Bank was the microfinance big innovation that really basically gave small loans to poor rural women, like a bank, but without any collateral. The collateral was always that these poor rural women would be too scared not to pay back, so they would pay back because they were powerless, right? But they, used it to feed their families in the bad times, or to invest in small businesses, or to do all kinds of things like that.
Yeah.
And that's really, in Bangladesh at least, that's been remarkable. There's a lot of criticism about microfinance in other parts of the world, but in Bangladesh at least, it's.
I think in general it has been a lot more beneficial than formal finance, and it has impacted a lot of regions in the global south, even outside of Bangladesh. But Bangladesh does seem to have this very apparent woman empowerment movement. Like, it's a lot stronger in Bangladesh than it is in India or Pakistan. And I think you have is it called the Begums? Or,
The Begums. So there's both our major, our prominent politicians for the last 30, 40 years have been women, right? Sheikh Hasina was herself the daughter of the founding father, if you like, of the country, Sheikh Mujib, who was murdered in 1975 with the rest of the family, apart from her and one other sister who was out of town. And then her chief rival, who, if she wasn't so ill and elderly now, would no doubt be prime minister again quite soon, is Begum Khaleda Zia, who was actually the widow of another political leader, Zia Rahman, who was a military turned civilian president in the 70s and 80s. No, in fact, he was assassinated in 81, I think it was. So you have both of these women who have had political power, and both have done really quite amazing things until recently, at least until a decade ago. Sheikh Hasina was, doing really quite good things for the country. And even amidst all of the disappearances and the violence, there were still some really good things going on in Bangladesh. I think we should remind ourselves of that. But yes, so it's very visibly much more female, I believe, than Pakistan or than India. The garments industry employs a lot of women. That was really transformative. So for a relatively poor, very, very predominantly Muslim country, our women are very active, very visible, very prominent in everyday life. Yeah.
You mentioned, Bangladesh was before East Pakistan. Not many people talk about Bangladesh in the world scene, but I find it really interesting how there's all this conflict between Pakistan and India, and there seems not to be that conflict equally with India and Bangladesh. Why is that?
Well, right now on social media, there's basically a war of disinformation going on, probably funded by the Modi government, about what's happening in Bangladesh, which is why you have such a negative idea of what's been happening in Bangladesh, because that's what the world knows now. And Bangladesh just doesn't have the skills or the resources to combat, however many billion Indians there are tweeting and posting about, a genocide against minorities, which is not happening in Bangladesh. It's not happening. There have been attacks on minorities. There have been issues like that, but it's by no means a genocide, by no means a concerted campaign. Law and order has been quite weak. So there is that going on. It's, if you like, a Cold War, an online war. But Bangladesh cannot possibly get into a big fight with India. They're very, very keen. The current government, the interim government, and the next government will be too, very keen to have good relations with India for 100 million reasons. They're the big neighbor. It's like being Canada and saying, you know what, we're going to war with the US. No, you don't do that. Well, Canada's not really a good example because it's not small enough. What's a good example of a very small country next to a very big country?
Mexico.
Okay. Well, it's also not such a small country, but supposing I can't think of a small country near China. Bhutan, let's say, against China. Bangladesh, of course, is bigger, but not much bigger. You don't want to have a big fight with your big neighbor. You don't want to have a big fight. There's so many reasons why. They control the water, from the Ganges. They so many things. Transport. They've currently cut the transshipment routes for road shipment of garments garments products. Bangladesh cannot afford to piss off India and just doesn't want to.
But then there needs to be an ability to fight for certain things. Like,
you think we should get nuclear weapons in Bangladesh?
No. But I've heard, for example,
because they do in India, right?
Yeah.
And Pakistan.
I've heard you mention, like, I think there's, I don't know if it's China or India, but they want to reroute a waterway or something in Bangladesh, a river.
There's a dam higher up the the rivers that does affect Bangladesh. Last September, just after Sheikh Hasina fell, and she was the big Modi ally in Bangladesh. Just after that, there were massive floods in India, and they opened the floodgates literally. I mean, I don't think it was deliberate to harm Bangladesh, but it did end up harming Bangladesh. We had massive floods last September, just after all of this violence had gone on. I don't know enough about, the water situation in Bangladesh to talk authoritatively. But it's one of the reasons why Bangladesh government's quite restrained when it comes to its relations with India. One of the reasons.
I guess, yeah, it's the laws of nature, right? The powerful rule the world, and I guess you have to go along with it. It's kind of a...
As we are seeing in these interesting times in early 2025.
Yeah. I guess as we've seen it since so long, right? Human history.
No, I don't know if I would agree with you there. I think that something changed in the last couple of years. We used to have something called international law. We used to have human rights. These are all gone now. After Gaza, there's no international law is just a fiction now. Now it is. Now you're right. It's might is right. But for decades after the Second World War, there was a structure. There was an edifice of laws and conventions and practices, which now ruthless people are just saying no. Don't need that. I'll just do what I feel like.
Yeah, and it does seem like it's a unequal application of power, because even the ICC kind of people don't really care about that anymore. Like I don't remember which country, but ICC, like, was it the Malaysia or the Philippines? Like their leader was, like, the court said, yeah, you need to be arrested, and he got arrested.
Oh, Duterte, yes,
And-
Rodrigo Duterte, yes, that's right. And he became the first non-African person charged under the International Criminal Courts. That's
Yeah.
right.
But so they can apply their power to certain countries and others no.
No, I know.
So
it's
it's
quite something. Well, they're under sanctions. Their judges are under sanctions by the US, right? They can't do anything. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the US in particular has basically abandoned international law, first under Biden and now under Trump. They both did it to protect Israel, I guess. I don't know why else they did it. That seems to be the only reason, the only benefit they've had from it. So,
to go back, you said 1971 was a key, crucial moment. So what goes down in 1971? Bangladesh gains their independence, but I'm assuming it doesn't happen just out of nowhere. What led up to that, and what happened
wow.
that really marked Bangladesh?
I mean, it's a very tragic time. It was really bloody war. The country was really devastated. There were mass rapes. There were probably hundreds of thousands of Bangladeshi women were raped by the Pakistani forces and by their collaborators. It was a very tragic time. And it took Bangladesh many years to recover. After that war, it had all sorts of problems. There were 10 million people displaced to India. India really helped. India then came in mainly because of the refugee war and basically, basically fought Pakistan and won on behalf of Bangladesh. We had a guerrilla, really quite a ragtag group of guerrillas fighting in the jungles of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is, as I said, in the Bay of Bengal, there's a lot of places you can hide if you know what you're doing. And they were fighting these Pakistani forces, which didn't necessarily know how to do guerrilla jungle warfare. But still, it took 9 months. I mean, the trigger for it really was, I mentioned this enormous cyclone that 500,000 people died in. And this is, why it's so important to recognize the links between ecology, between climate change, essentially, and conflict. This is one of the first cases of this, probably. In 1970, there was a massive cyclone, and there'd been many cyclones in this area, in an area called Pola in the south. And probably about 500,000 people were killed, just wiped out, washed out into the sea. There was a 20-foot or 12-foot high tidal wave that just washed everyone out. I mean, these people were living in, quite fragile, maybe thatched houses, the farmers, fisherfolk, those sorts of people. The whole area was devastated. And the country was at this point was part of Pakistan. But the rulers in West Pakistan, they didn't even know that this had happened for several days because there was no communication. West Pakistan was where all the investment was. It was where the army was. It was where industry was. Bangladesh, as far as, or East Bengal or East Pakistan as it was in those days, as far as they were concerned, was just a bunch of farmers. There was a kind of a racial dimension to this as well. They looked upon themselves as better Muslims. They're tall and strong and pale-skinned, and Bangladeshis are small and, more syncretic in their religion, more the Bengali culture, and the Hindu aspects of the Bengali culture were much more mixed in with the way we practice Islam in East Pakistan in those days. So they looked down on us. They thought we were poor and rubbish and we had all of these cyclones. And so this thing happened and they didn't really care. Like there was very little response. It was some days before the Pakistan government sent anyone to help. But this is the 1970s, so this seems like a long time ago. In fact, it was even before I was born. But TV news was just a thing then. It was just starting, right? And so this was one of the first big disasters that hit the TV, that hit the world. The world who could watch the TV saw this, and they'd never seen anything like this devastation before. And they all sent people to help. From all around the world, they sent people to help. The NGO Médecins Sans Frontières, they got started during that. That was their first, they weren't called that then, but their people first showed up for that. Another really big NGO that I used to work for, BRAC, they also got started then. So a lot of these organizations really cut their teeth on this cyclone. But everyone was horrified because the Pakistan government didn't give a shit. They were just like, well, this stuff happens a lot in this place. So this was a real trigger because a couple of weeks later, they had elections. And this was the first democratic elections they'd ever had in Pakistan. Sheikh Hasina's father won a landslide in this election and should have been made the prime minister of all of Pakistan because he won basically all the seats in the East Wing and, there was, he had the majority. Essentially, he should have been the prime minister, but they were not having some Bengali, some inferior person rule over their country. They were just shocked. And so they sent the army in to suppress this, what had become a national liberation movement by this time. People were so angry about the way the Pakistanis treated the victims of the cyclone, but also this was after, years and years of neglect and discrimination. So there you go.
And then revolts happen and people demand independence.
Yeah, they did. They demanded independence. They were led by this Sheikh Mujib. They went so the army came, killed lots and lots of people. It was essentially one of those wars in which it had genocidal elements for sure. They were trying to really wipe out a whole class of people, all of the intellectuals and the leadership. They went deliberately to the main university, Dhaka University, and killed hundreds of the leading scientists and intellectuals and so on, deliberately. It's a particular form of scholasticide, genocide. So then an army was formed. These young chaps went off, and women, in fact, went off into the jungles and started fighting the Pakistanis. And 9 months later, the Indians stepped in and helped out and got rid of them.
And then 3 years later, a famine happens.
3 years later, famine. I know it was not, the 1970s was so disastrous. It was major cyclone in 1970 that killed 500,000 people. Then the war, and hundreds of thousands probably were killed there. We don't really know. Hundreds of thousands were raped. People were displaced, 10 million displaced people. Then in 74, you had this enormous famine. And this is something I've worked a lot on. People don't really talk about the famine of 74.
I didn't even know it happened.
Yeah, it's a long time ago, right? It was a bit before your time. 1974. But it is one of the famines that Amartya Sen, you've read Amartya Sen, you economists, I'm sure, haven't you? His famous essay on famine, which was really groundbreaking for famine, for how we understand famine, because before people used to think famines happened because there was a disaster and the crops were spoiled, or maybe there was a war. And then we understood from Amartya Sen's work that actually a famine is not that there isn't enough food, it's that people cannot afford to buy it, whatever food there is. Look, for instance, at what's happening in Gaza right now, right? People are being starved deliberately. Often these things are deliberate. Sometimes they are the way the market works. In 1974 in Bangladesh, so it was a very poor country in those days, really, really poor. A lot of the agriculture and the infrastructure were just devastated after the war. In 1974, there were massive floods. Again, very, very exposed ecologically. This country is still very, very exposed. Massive floods, and they wiped out some of the crops. But in particular, what the floods of 1974 did, they meant that there was no wage labor available. So a lot of the poorest people were landless farmers. Like, they had no land of their own. They would work on people's, they would do very low paid wage labor. But there was no work to do, so they weren't getting paid. So there was some rice, but there wasn't enough of it. And so prices went very high. People left their homes. And the Bangladesh government was broke. They'd been trying out all this socialist stuff. It hadn't worked out for them. There was the 1973-1974 OPEC oil price crisis. Oil prices shot up, which meant food prices shot up. So
terrible timing.
It was really, the whole thing was absolute catastrophe. When I read the lists of things that happened, I'm like, oh my God, it was just. And the Bangladesh government went to, it was Henry Kissinger and no, was Nixon in power at that point? No, it was Gerald Ford by this point, and asked them. Initially, it was Richard Nixon, and then later, when he was toppled, it was Gerald Ford, I think, and asked them for food aid. America was the food aid provider in those days. It still is, I think, one of the major food aid providers. And food aid, U.S. food aid, as you know, was not necessarily just to help poor people. It was to help American farmers find markets, because they'd industrialized their food system. They had so much food they couldn't sell in the US, so they had to find markets for it. It's one of the reasons why they set up the World Food Program. In 1974, they had rather less food aid than they usually had because of the OPEC oil price crisis. And they decided that they wouldn't send the food to Bangladesh. And they knew that they were starving. They knew they were going to die in their millions. 1.5 million people died in the end. But they didn't send it, and they said it was because Bangladesh had traded with Cuba, and Cuba was a communist nation, and under the terms of their law, Bangladesh could not have food aid because it had sold $5 million of jute sacks to Cuba.
Wow.
Quite deliberately.
Wow.
I think it was quite deliberate on their part, because I think they wanted to get the Bangladesh government to behave itself, to align more with the US and less with, potentially, with Russia. This was the Cold War, right?
Mm.
The height of the Cold War. And, eventually that is what Bangladesh did. They stopped trying this socialist stuff, and they agreed to a bunch of economic reforms. They devalued the currency. And then a year after all of this, the Americans finally sent the food aid, but by that time, 1.5 million people were dead.
Wow.
I don't blame only the Americans for this. The government of the time really could have done things differently. They were feeding a lot of middle-class people with the food aid that they did have, because they were scared that middle-class people were going to revolt if they didn't, because food prices were high, echoes of 2024 or the other way around. So, yeah, that was a terrible tragedy. But I think personally, and I've written a lot about this, I think 1974 really is the thing that set Bangladesh on a relatively successful, relatively pro-poor, inclusive model of development.
How so?
I think that in 1975, Sheikh Hasina's father, Sheikh Mujib, was murdered, and all of her family were also murdered with him. Many people saw the famine as his fault. They saw that his ineptitude, his inability to manage the situation had been the cause of it. Many people in the Awami League government at that time were actually stealing food aid, stealing relief. Imagine, while people were starving. And there was a real anger about it because they just fought this liberation war 1,000 days earlier. 1,000 days earlier, the rich and the poor, everyone had come together to fight for liberation, and now they were, the middle class people were eating, the rich people were having a big party, and the poor people were starving. So there was a real sense of, they left us on our own. We weren't in it together. It changed a lot of people's minds about a lot of things. It meant people like Professor Yunus of the Grameen Bank. He writes about how he got started during the famine. He's an economics professor, right? He's trained in economics, got his PhD in economics, and he's trying to teach economics in Chittagong University, and people are starving around him. And he writes in his biography, I just felt so useless. I had to do something. And this is why he set up this Grameen Bank, this lending program. In fact, he talked about this only last week. They had a big investment summit in Bangladesh, and now that he's the person in charge, at least temporarily, they had all of these foreign investors come from all over the world, and he was talking about the history of Bangladesh, and he started talking about 1974, what a transformation Bangladesh has experienced from 1974 to now. He started crying. It was so moving. It was so sad. So people like him, it really affected some of the great leaders of our country, political leaders, and societal leaders and others. It really affected them.
Have you met him?
I did meet him once, actually, in London.
What was he like?
He's just
Nice
very
chap.
clever. He's very nice. He's very personable, of course. I mean, I know some of the people who work very closely with him, but I never worked with Grameen Bank, so I never really got to know him. But yes, he's well liked. He's takes all this seriously. Of course, now he's a very famous person. He's been in The Simpsons.
Has it?
Yeah.
I feel like this rings a bell. What was the episode?
I don't know. There were two of them. I think he's in it twice, I think. He's definitely in it, though. I think Lisa at some point wants to do microfinance or something in The Simpsons. I always think that's a sign you've arrived, right?
Sorry, that's just so ridiculous.
I know, but come on, it's so
Only
Lisa
The
Simpson, right?
Simpsons.
Yeah. If you're in The Simpsons, you're definitely... So he's like, he's sort of stratospheric. He got the Nobel Prize and all of that. But yeah.
I guess it's quite interesting that Bangladesh still managed to achieve a lot of growth despite the rampant corruption from the Sheikh Hasina family. And on the topic of the Sheikh Hasina family, I thought I'd ask you about a certain Tulip Siddiq.
So I don't know anything about this situation. Okay. And I feel a little bit uncertain about it because I'll just say, as an accountability specialist, I think it looks very bad to have an anti-corruption minister who has somewhat murky-looking private financial affairs. But that does not mean that she has done anything wrong. You cannot choose your family, right?
So Tulip Siddiq didn't actually do anything wrong. It was just
I don't know if she did or didn't, but I don't think we can assume she did just because her family are who they are, right?
Okay.
But nevertheless, some of her private, housing situation and so on, the stories uncovered by the Financial Times and the other newspapers, it's not very clear. Like if you were, maybe this would be true for any of us, right? If you look at it, why did your daddy give you that house, or why did your aunt let you stay in her house? Whatever, maybe it always looks a bit funny, but I am not the anti-corruption minister for the City of London, right? So it doesn't matter quite so much. I think someone who is the anti-corruption minister for the City of London should not have anything that looks murky in their background, is my personal opinion.
I think that's a good way to sort of see the situation. So I think it's very kind of black and white. People are like, oh, she's corrupt.
It's not obvious that she is, yeah.
Okay, that's quite interesting.
I wanted to ask, do you think we'd ever, in COVID time, people were really started panicking, toilet paper started going missing and stuff, people started stacking food. Do you think we could experience a famine here in the UK?
In the UK? No, I don't think so. Industrialized food is in such a, in such a way now that food is cheap and so on. What we do have, of course, in the advanced industrial countries, so in the US in particular, is you have food deserts, and you have an epidemic of well, they say overnourishment, they mean obesity. People eat really, really bad food because it's cheaper. So they're very, very large, but they're very, very unhealthy.
Yeah.
It's a kind of food crisis. You're not going to die of starvation, but you'll die of hypertension and cholesterol and other things. So
I saw a stat this morning, it was a map of Europe. It was just showing the percentage of household that buys over processed or ultra processed foods. And you have France at 14%, Italy 13%, and the UK is sitting just over 50%.
Sure.
Which is just crazy.
I'm sure. There's some really good work done on ultra processed foods. I used to work a lot on food politics. I mean, I suppose I still do when I write about famine and stuff. But one of the single greatest indicators of a sharp rise in obesity is the presence of a free trade agreement.
Wow. So
when you get a free trade agreement, people start, especially with the US, I guess, start buying very, very cheap food. I think in Central America, when NAFTA came in, it became a very common thing. People would have this enormous bottle of Coke on the dining table, right, which you wouldn't have had before. And suddenly kids are eating these addictive, highly fatty, highly sugary foods. But, you asked a really good question. Would we ever have a famine in England? We used to have, until the 18th century, until the 19th century, actually, food riots in the UK. People, working people suddenly couldn't afford bread. The price of bread would shoot up for various reasons, often because, corn prices had gone up or down, whatever. And this was, a really powerful way of sending a message. These are kinds of protests, right? Sending a message to the ruling classes that, the system is not working for me. You're letting grain traders make a profit. Meanwhile, my family are hungry. So these things have happened in the past. I think that, we saw in 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, there was this enormous number of protests around the world. It was all to do with food and energy prices going up. And governments, slashing subsidies, governments cutting benefits because they, needed the money. It was just after COVID, after all. And people really came out in the streets in a really big way. I did a piece of work with a PhD student. In those days, I was at American University in DC. We did a piece of work looking at the data on this. And there were more than 12,000 protests around the world about food and energy prices. And people are, angry. And then climate change, right? What's going to happen to the food system? Who knows? Who knows which countries are going to be, in years to come, are still going to have food supplies. I think it's one of the reasons why Donald Trump is doing some of the things he's doing now, is that fear that if in a very interconnected, globalized system, climate change means that things are going to go wrong in one part of the supply chain. You want to make sure you have everything in your, in your reach, in your country. The UK will be really in trouble because we import so much food and, nobody wants to work on the farm. And we import inputs and we all have very sophisticated food tastes now. How would we do without our avocados?
Yeah,
I
love avocado.
I couldn't survive without my avocado, I'll tell you that.
Your generation. Netflix and avo toast.
Can't beat it. Can't beat it.
But it is an interesting point that you said that the free trade is causing a lot of obesity. And we had a lot of farmers' protests. And I know, for example, in the EU, it's a big problem where the EU puts a lot of, legislation and things to force the farmers to grow food in a certain type of way and to follow certain guidelines, climate change, but also certain quality of food, of how you grow the food and raise it. And then at the same time, they'll start making deals with Brazil and South America where they don't have any of those, restrictions, and they can grow food with all these GMOs and all this stuff and have their goods be imported and compete with all these local farmers that have all these restrictions. And the food, yeah, it's hard to not empathize with the farmers, right?
Yeah, I mean it's an incredible. I mean the way our food system has been transformed over the last 100 years is really quite remarkable. Like we don't eat anything like, the way your great grandparents ate. They wouldn't know what, they wouldn't recognize your food. In sitting in London, avocados. Hello, what? All of this. It's crazy, isn't it? I think there's so much to know. I think food systems, food regimes. There's a whole body of work on food regimes, food ways. I mean, there's so much. It's such an important area. So much of it. There's politics. There's finance. The way food is traded as a commodity. It's a huge
it's crazy.
thing.
Like meat, they buy meat gets transported country to country. Like some guy was telling me, he was like, I think he worked in the business of trading cattle, and he was telling me like,
is that in Chicago? I think it happens in Chicago, the big trading thing. Is it? Yeah.
And he was just telling me that some of these cattle just get traded like 60 countries before they arrive in your supermarket. It's just crazy.
God. I mean, I guess it's nominally, like they don't actually physically get moved to 60 countries, but they're on a computer screen somewhere. Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's incredibly complex. It's also very quite a divisive field as well, actually, food. There's the people who are very keen on globalization and industrialized food system. They see the Green Revolution as an unmitigated good thing. And then there's the people who are very, very critical and anxious about what this all means. When we have these enormous thousands of hectares of miles of monocropping, when you're just growing wheat and there's nothing else growing, and then you have a blight or something, and we never used to grow food in this way, and the soils are being depleted. Soil depletion is a huge issue. All of these issues.
I guess the big question is this sustainable, in the long term?
It's definitely not.
Because my family, they're very, because they have this idea that, because growing up, food would be very localized. It's what the land offers you. And that's for years, that's how, for like centuries even, that's just, for the entire of human existence, that's how we've eaten. It's
exactly.
What's what the land offers. And now it's like we can get tropical fruits, like, all the time consistently, but maybe we should start to be more localized, because these complex systems,
I think
they're not sustainable.
I think we can. I think we shouldn't overdo it though. I often think about food has traveled around the world. I spend a lot of time in Ethiopia, and I'm always amazed at how many food items come from elsewhere and how many Ethiopian food items travel. So, for instance, I think of the samosa as a Bangladeshi thing. We have this in Bangladesh. It's not at all a Bangladeshi thing. It's a Kenyan thing. They have it in Kenya. They have it in Ethiopia. They call it sambusa. You have it all over the Middle East. You have it, you'll have it in the corner shop in London. It's traveled. It's just a pastry filled with something savory. It's, and it's the same with things like, injera. What do they call it? There's so many.
Do you
food
guys
like
eat
this.
gulab jamun? I think that's what they call it in India. It's like those dough balls.
Gulab jamun, the sweets, gulab jamun,
So in Nigeria, we have it and we call it puff puff.
Oh, really? Is it the same?
Yeah, it's exactly the same.
Oh no, and soaked in the syrup and everything.
We don't soak it in the syrup, though. But then the Greeks also have it. What do they call theirs? I can't remember, but everyone has it, and you think, "Oh, this is Nigeria,
very local,
it's the best." And then it's like, "Oh, hey," you speak to someone else, and they have it, and then they have it, and it's like a lot of the food is.
It's true. So you have to think.
Around.
So and it's been centuries and millennia, perhaps, of people traveling around. I mean, I love my food, and I love to eat. I love to go to restaurants and cook and all that. I'd hate to think that I had to eat whatever you can grow in South London for the rest of my life.
Whatever the River Thames has to offer.
Clapham Common would be interesting. But I cooked the other day gallo pinto, the rice and beans, right?
So I love rice and beans.
I do too. And,
Gets
you
me
know, we
going.
have it in 100 different, you know, there's a quite famous book called Rice and Beans, a local dish in 100 countries. Because everywhere has a rice and, I mean, not Europe. Europeans don't really eat much rice, but rice and beans, you know, everywhere around the world, they have a version of rice and beans, and it's just like the best. But you know, these things travel, right? So I think that's a nice thing.
But this is what Hadron Chang says in his book and a lot of his
it's a
work.
wonderful book. Yeah.
It's colonialism is responsible for a lot of the foods we're accustomed to.
Yeah.
And like without colonialism, we probably don't have a lot of our national cuisines. It's quite
That's
interesting.
right. It is interesting, isn't it? I mean, like tea, for instance, right? I mean, and when did the Americans bring? Was it the Americans who brought corn to Africa? You know, maize. I mean, you know, it's all of the stuff that we think we take for granted is so.
The tomato.
Pasta in Italy, right? I mean,
like the tomato, that's a staple in so many cuisines, and that was something that was spread during these times.
And the potato and the chili. You know, in South Asia, we think chili is what, you know, we eat chili, but chili comes from South America.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of good stuff about globalization. I won't say good stuff about colonialism, but you know, let's stop there.
But some people, you know, regarding that argument, say that there's a new factor that comes in with climate change that say we shouldn't. It's almost 7.
I have to go.
Shall we wrap it up?
Yeah,
All
sorry,
right.
I have a dinner date.
Thank you so much.
Sorry. An absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Yeah,
really great,
it's really nice talking to you.
thanks for
I will
speaking with
listen
us.
to your podcast from now on, and I will get some tips from you on how to do this. I want to do a podcast too.
Oh, that's very sweet of you.
We highly recommend it. It's a lot of
Great.
fun.
Yeah,
It was very nice to meet you.
an absolute pleasure.